Hey guys, there was a big showdown yesterday in Senekal, Free State, South Africa. Well, it was advertised as a showdown, but it ended up being pretty much just a flash in the pan. Not a whole lot happened. The proximate cause for this particular event at this particular place was another farm murder, which are becoming increasingly prevalent in South Africa. Usually, white farmers or white farm workers or white farm managers will be murdered by, surrounding blacks or sometimes the black employees of these farms. And oftentimes, nothing is stolen or not much is stolen. And these murders occur in very gruesome ways and just over the top kind of violence. And so it's speculated that a lot of these are racially motivated. And there's a lot of resentment on the part of some blacks in South Africa towards these white farmers, because there are all these narratives about how the land was stolen from them and how, these farmers are exploiting them and mistreating them. Most of these narratives are false or at least greatly exaggerated, as they are everywhere else, as they are, for example, in America with the Black Lives Matter narrative, where they say that white cops are systematically hunting them down and killing them because they're black, even though that's not happening. And let me just briefly explain why most of these narratives are false or at least overblown. And mainly what it has to do with is whose land it is and whose land it was originally. Now, most of the land in South Africa was not historically occupied by black tribes. There are those on our side who say none of it was. That's false also. But in general, the black tribes tended to be more towards the east coast of South Africa. And then the white settlers started settling in the Cape area in the far southwest. And they didn't run into each other for a good long time, like 120 years or something like that. And there were people living in the Cape and in between where the whites settled in the Cape and where the blacks were living in the east. Those people were Khoisan people. So if anybody has a right to complain about this kind of stuff in South Africa, it's the Khoisan. However, the blacks living in the east had previously displaced, Khoisan groups or similar groups from those lands. And so if they had continued expanding into Khoisan lands in the west or the southwest, those people would probably be greatly less well off today than they are living with the whites, or that they were living with the whites. So, if you're a more primitive society and a less developed society, you're going to end up at the mercy of somebody stronger. And it's far better to end up at the mercy of whites than at the mercy of Bantus, say. So, historically, that has not been a very good place to be. So whatever grounds for complaint that these Khoisan have, which are undoubtedly more legitimate than the black Bantu tribes have, are still ultimately, they're almost lucky in a way that the whites showed up when they did, because if they hadn't, they would probably be in an even worse situation. And if not already by now, at least, at some point in the future, they would have been. So, and the other thing was when the white settlers left the Cape Colony and headed inland to found new republics because they were escaping British rule. The Cape Colony came under the control of the British, and many of the original Dutch settlers either were unhappy with that or became unhappy with that at some point subsequent to that. And so they packed up their wagons and they left into the interior of the country. And those are known as the four-trekkers, and that migration is known as the Great Trek. And they found some tribes in those lands, and they found some empty lands, and those lands were empty because of something called the Mfikani, or the crushing that the Zulu had done, where they had attacked many of the tribes around them so savagely that they had simply picked up and left, leaving a wide area around the Zulu more or less uninhabited. Now, this is not something peculiar to the Zulu. Germanic tribes used to do this in Roman times. They would consider it a mark of their prowess as warriors that nobody would want to live anywhere near them. And so there were great uninhabited swaths of land between tribes. Well, the Boers moved into one of these, or some of these, and of course, they had fights with the Zulus and others, and they had treaties which delineated the boundaries of the land, and there were even some purchase arrangements. I'm sure they were under duress, but that's what happens when you fight somebody and they win. You have to accept the terms that they offer you. That's how it works. So to be whining about it now, years later, and as I understand it, it's not even really the Zulus who whine about it the most. I'm not necessarily going to pick on the tribes that do, but it doesn't seem to be them predominantly. But the narrative is that they're relatively impoverished because of this loss of land and because of exploitation and mistreatment at the hands of these farmers, which is actually kind of backwards. They're not relatively impoverished. They're relatively well off by African standards. They might feel impoverished because the farmers themselves are even better off. And that's maybe a more relevant comparison to them than to compare them to some other, Black African tribe in some other African country that they maybe are not personally familiar with. And they don't get a chance to become personally familiar because South African tribes are also known for their xenophobia. There have been numerous incidents where Black African immigrants to South Africa have been lynched and murdered by Black South African mobs because the perception is that they're coming in and sponging off of the positive externalities created by the whites. I'm sure they don't articulate this specifically, but this is what they're picking up on. These immigrants are coming in and enjoying the benefits created by these whites, and that they can't tolerate. They don't want to share. And so there's an extreme level of xenophobia against these outsiders who are coming in from other countries. So that's all, between blacks, among blacks. So that's kind of an implicit or a tacit admission that there are benefits created by these whites for the blacks, and they don't want to share those benefits. They may not even be acknowledging that to themselves, but they must be picking up on it to some extent. Now, these narratives, these resentment-fueled narratives that motivate the EFF and others in South Africa, extreme kind of, let's say, left-wing oriented parties, because they all have kind of a Marxist lexicon and rhetoric and ideology to them. These narratives are false. These arguments are false. These justifications are false. There may, however, be a sort of evolutionary sense to what they're doing, an evolutionary logic in opposing and trying to wipe out a potentially powerful adversary, a potentially powerful competitor, a potentially powerful enemy group, foreign group, alien, other group in the form of these white, what were settlers, now farmers in South Africa. And of course, all the justifications for this are bogus, right? But the justifications don't have to be true if there's some sort of evolutionary payoff from doing the deeds that these justifications urge. And so it is a bit understandable what is going on in light of that. But that doesn't mean we have to sympathize with them, or that we can't sympathize with the plight of the white farmers who, after all, are just trying to live their lives and make a living in the way that suits them and in the place where they ended up by the the chain of historical events through which their ancestors navigated. So they're in a sticky situation where they're being targeted for these murders at an extremely high rate, like a shockingly high rate, something like 130 per 100,000 is the murder rate for farmers in South Africa. It's, I think, probably, if not the highest in the world, at least very close. That's pretty close to the murder rate of Mexico, which is like the number one murder capital of the world right now. So they're being murdered for racial reasons, primarily, it seems. And the authorities are not being particularly effective or particularly proactive in addressing this. They're not even being very reactive. They did arrest some subjects and they're trying some suspects in this particular case, but the farmers have pretty much had enough at this point. And some of them were making, talking like they were ready to do something about it. But then you had, on the other hand, the others saying, no, violence is not the answer. Now is not the time. Don't bring your guns. Don't start anything. Don't react to any provocation by these EFF people. And that seems to have been the voice that carried the day, which I guess I don't really have any room to talk, because the South Africans are most likely still going to get to the point of having had enough before we do, or before anybody else does. So I can't really sit back here and criticize them from across an ocean on that front. But it is a little disappointing because there's only one way that this is going to change. They need to get some distance between themselves and these people who want to murder them and hate them just for existing and for being who they are. And, there's nothing that's going to fix this except for separation and distance and some kind of borders between them. It's too late for any other solutions, except for maybe even more extreme solutions than that. And they're not just going to be given their independence, because I think there is still understanding that they do produce a lot of benefits. And so to give them their independence is to represent, it's a loss of those benefits. It'll be felt as a loss. It'll be seen as a loss. And so it's not going to be granted cheaply. And fundamentally, they lost their sovereignty in 1994 when their leaders handed it over to the ANC, to the most powerful Black African party in South Africa, and by holding democratic elections. So, they lost their sovereignty because they accepted democracy as a very small minority. And they got some promises of protection from Nelson Mandela, and that they could keep their property and things like that. But ultimately, it was up to his discretion. And even though he mostly lived up to what he said he was going to do, his successors are a different story. And so those promises ultimately depend on their whim and their discretion and their pleasure to continue to uphold those. And increasingly, like this EFF group in particular, does not want to uphold them. They want to appropriate the farms without compensation. They want to do in South Africa what happened in Zimbabwe, what totally ruined the Zimbabwe economy and destabilized Zimbabwe and turned it from a breadbasket into a basket case. They want to repeat that in South Africa, and they don't seem to care. They either don't know or they don't care what the consequences of that will be, even for them. But even the ANC, which until now has been mostly content to boil the frog somewhat slowly, now has to go more radical to avoid losing votes to this newer, more radical EFF party. So the situation is deteriorating rapidly, and there's not really any way to work it out in the context of a democratic system where there is majority rule. Because, once they've accepted that, they've lost their sovereignty, and that majority, which appears to be the ANC influenced by the EFF for now, and maybe, for who knows how long, arbitrarily long, they can do what they want. And, a small minority like the Boers, they don't have much recourse. Because even if they go to the courts or whatever, the elected government can change the laws, can change the Constitution even, and or just ignore the courts. That's always an option too. That happens in a lot of systems. So they gave away their sovereignty. They would have been better off if they had kept some of it in the form of like a power sharing deal where they get a veto, so the blacks can't just unilaterally take from them or unilaterally impose upon them. And they did insist on that at first, but they eventually, gave up. They let the ANC wear them down to accepting democracy, majority-ruled democracy, and gave up their sovereignty. Specifically, the leaders gave up sovereignty on behalf of, the other whites. So, once you lose sovereignty, it's a very difficult thing to regain. And so there's really only one path to regaining it. And that path leads through being feared. Because if they're not feared, they can just be, fleeced and exploited and lorded over and murdered one by one at will. And so in order to escape that fate, they have to regain their sovereignty. And in order for anybody to be willing to give them their sovereignty, they have to fear to deny them their sovereignty. And so they're going to have to do terrible things in order to reclaim their sovereignty, in order to carve out a homeland for their people that's safe and secure and that has borders behind which they can shelter from these hostile groups that mean them harm and don't have their good in mind. And that's really the only path towards that. And I'm not singling them out in that regard, because we're all substantially in the same situation. We're just not as far along. We're all in that same boat. We've all either essentially given up our sovereignty as Western men, or we're on a slow path towards that fate with no apparent indication that it's going to turn around in time before we do lose our sovereignty to, let's say, a demographic deluge that turns us into a minority with no hope of being able to influence democratic politics on a large scale in our own countries. So we're all in the same boat. We're all headed towards the same place. They're just a little further along than we are. And a friend of mine says, Boers are like white people from the future. And that's really the state of it. South Africa is a test case for how Western civilization is going to go. Is it going to rise again in some form, in some enclave, in some Boer Volksstaat, an independent Boer Volksstaat or ethno-state, or is it going to continue to fall towards the third world mean? Just like in every other Western country, we're a few decades behind them, or maybe a century behind them at the most, but we're headed to the exact same place. This is a test case. Are they going to be able to reclaim control of their destiny and retain their independence as a people, their self-determination, their distinct national and cultural and ethnic identity? Are they going to be able to retain that, or maybe more accurately reclaim that? Because it's already effectively been lost, even though, let's say an echo of it remains. In the form of these people who now exist under the yoke of this rainbow nation that wishes they didn't exist and has the power to make that happen, even if, perhaps slowly over the course of a few decades. So that's their predicament. That's what they're going to have to do to get out of it. And substantially, that's what we're all going to have to do to get out of it. There's not much way around that. So it didn't happen yesterday. Perhaps it'll happen someday. But more and more people seem to be getting fed up. More and more people seem to be getting angry. More and more people seem to be getting to the point where they don't care about the odds anymore, or the cost, or the risks. They want to take that one shot that they have, before they exit the stage and leave an even worse situation to their children and grandchildren. And everybody's going to have to make that choice for themselves. But I think if the Boers do make that choice, they have a fighting shot. They took on the British Empire at the height of its power, and it was only 70,000 of them against 400,000 British soldiers. Pretty sure the South African military, even allowing for advances in technology and whatnot, doesn't begin to compare to the power of the British Empire at its peak. And there are more Boers, and they have access to the better technology too. So they have a fighting shot, even though they are a tiny minority. They're 5% of the population, excluding the portion of whites who are English. The Boers are approximately 5% of the population in South Africa. But they have the numbers and the resources, if they but had the will, to carve out at least a portion of that land for their own, for a homeland for their people, where they can live according to their culture and their values, and chart their own course and seek their own destiny. They have that power if they but have the will. And that's the same situation and the same predicament substantially that we are all in.